Not Korean enough. The child Korea tried to reject. The classroom door slammed shut behind him, and 30 pairs of eyes locked onto Joon-Ayo like spotlights on a stage he never auditioned for. His heart hammered against his ribs as he gripped the straps of his backpack, knuckles white, standing frozen at the front of the room. The teacher, Mrs. Park, gestured for him to come forward with a smile that seemed warm until he noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Class, we have a new student today," she announced, her voice cutting through the morning chatter. "Please introduce yourself." Joon-Ayo's mouth went dry. He'd practiced this moment 100 times in the mirror at home, his mother coaching him on proper bowing etiquette, his father telling him to stand tall. He bowed at exactly the right angle, the one his mother had measured with her hand against his back, and spoke in the clearest Korean he could manage. "Annyeonghaseyo, Gi-Rimun Park Joon-Ayo Yorshiku Wonge Shimasu." The last part slipped out in Japanese, a mistake born from nervousness. A ripple of giggles spread through the classroom like spilled water. Mrs. Park's smile faltered. She tilted her head, studying him the way someone might examine an unusual insect they'd found on their windowsill. "Park Joon-Ayo," she repeated slowly, as if testing the weight of each syllable. "That's an interesting name. Where are you really from?" 6-year-old Joon-Ayo didn't understand the question at first. He pointed vaguely in the direction he thought was home. "Seongbuk-dong, teacher. We live near the big park with the stone wall." More laughter now, louder this time. A boy in the front row whispered something to his neighbor, and both of them stared at Joon-Ayo's hair, his skin, his face, everything that marked him as different in a room where sameness was an unspoken requirement. Mrs. Park held up her hand for silence, but her expression had shifted into something harder to read. Pity, maybe, or discomfort. "I mean, where is your family originally from? Your father?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Joon-Ayo felt his face grow hot. "My appa is from Nigeria, teacher. My umma is Korean. I was born here in Seoul." The whispers exploded into full conversation. Children turned in their seats, openly pointing now. One girl with perfect pigtails tied with pink ribbons covered her mouth with both hands, eyes wide as if she'd just witnessed something shocking. A boy near the window stood up to get a better look until Mrs. Park snapped at him to sit down. "Nigeria," Mrs. Park repeated, and Joon-Ayo couldn't tell if she was explaining it to herself or to the class. "Well, that's very international. You may sit in the back for now. We'll find you a permanent seat later." The walk to the back of the classroom felt like crossing a desert. Every step echoed in his ears, amplified by the silence that had fallen over the room. He could feel their stares crawling over his skin like ants, examining every detail that made him foreign in his own birthplace. When he finally reached the empty desk in the corner, the one usually reserved for storage or punishment, he sat down and fixed his eyes on the textbook someone had left there, its pages worn and marked by a dozen students before him. That was the day Joon-Ayo learned that looking different could hurt in ways that left no visible scars. The afternoon sun streamed through the classroom windows during lunch, but Joon-Ayo ate his kimbap alone, while the other children formed tight circles of friendship that seemed to have no room for him. He watched them share snacks, trade stickers, make plans for after school, all the small intimacies of childhood that were supposed to be universal. But the space around his desk remained empty, as if he carried an invisible barrier that repelled anyone who might have wandered too close. A girl named Minji did approach once, drawn by curiosity rather than kindness. She stood at the edge of his desk and stared openly at his hair. "Can I touch it?" she asked, reaching out before he could answer. Joon-Ayo jerked his head away. "No." "Why is it like that? Like a sponge?" "It's just my hair. My mom says people with dark skin come from hot countries where they don't have civilization." She said it matter-of-factly, the way children repeat adult words without understanding their weight. Is that true? Joon-Ayo's throat tightened. He thought of his father, the way he dressed in pressed shirts every morning, the engineering degree from Lagos that hung in a frame in their tiny apartment, the careful way he spoke Korean with an accent that thickened when he was tired. He thought of the books that lined their shelves, the music his father played on Sunday mornings, the stories of home that felt both distant and immediate. "No," he said quietly, "that's not true." Minji shrugged, already losing interest. "Oh, my mom said it though." She skipped away, back to her circle of friends, where she immediately began whispering and pointing in his direction. When the bell rang for the end of the day, Joon-Ayo was the first one out the door. He ran the 6 blocks home without stopping, his backpack bouncing against his spine, his breath coming in sharp gasps that had more to do with unshed tears than exertion. He burst through the apartment door and found his mother in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She looked up, startled, the knife pausing midair. "Joon-Ayo, what's wrong?" He wanted to tell her everything. The stares, the questions, the girl who asked to touch his hair like he was an exhibit in a museum. But when he opened his mouth, different words came out. "Why did you marry Appa?" His mother set down the knife very carefully. She wiped her hands on her apron and crouched down to his level, her eyes searching his face. "What happened at school?" The teacher asked where I'm really from. Everyone laughed. She closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, they were bright with something that might have been tears or might have been anger. "Come here," she said, pulling him into a hug that smelled like sesame oil and the lavender soap she used. "I married your Appa because I love him, because he's the kindest, smartest, most wonderful man I've ever known. And you," she pulled back to look at him, her hands on his shoulders, "you are the best thing we ever made together." "But I'm different." "Different isn't bad. Everyone thinks it is." His mother's face crumpled slightly before she smoothed it back into strength. "Not everyone, not the people who matter." But 6-year-old Joon-Ayo didn't know who mattered yet. He only knew that school felt like a battlefield where he was armed with nothing but his presence, and presence wasn't enough. That night, his father came home from the factory with grease under his fingernails and exhaustion in every line of his body. Joon-Ayo heard his parents talking in low voices in the kitchen after he was supposed to be asleep. He crept to the doorway and listened, hidden in shadows. "They asked him where he's really from," his mother said, and her voice cracked on the word, really. "He was born here," his father replied, his Korean slower and more deliberate than his wife's. "He is Korean." "They don't see it that way." "Then they need new eyes." "Adebyo, please. You know it's not that simple." His father was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, sadder. "Do you ever regret it, marrying me?" "Never, not once, not even." Her voice dropped so low Joon-Ayo had to strain to hear. "Not even when my mother stopped speaking to me. Not even when your family asked when we're coming to Lagos and we both know we can never afford it. Not even now." "He will have to be stronger than other children." "He's 6. "I know, but the world doesn't care." Joon-Ayo retreated to his room before they could catch him listening. He climbed into bed and stared at the ceiling, where glow-in-the-dark stars formed constellations his father had taught him, both Korean and Yoruba names for the same patterns of light. He wondered if it was possible to be two things at once, or if being mixed meant being neither, a child caught between worlds that both claimed him and rejected him in equal measure. The weeks that followed established a pattern that would define his childhood. Each morning, his mother would pack his lunch with extra care, adding little notes in Hangul that said things like, "You are brave," and "You are loved." Each afternoon, he would come home and throw those notes away before she could ask about them, because kindness on paper couldn't shield him from the cruelty of casual exclusion. The other children didn't always bully him outright. Sometimes it was subtler, a project partner who did all the work without asking for his input, a birthday party invitation that never arrived. A game of soccer at recess where he was always picked last, if he was picked at all. He learned to make himself smaller, quieter, less noticeable. He perfected the art of eating lunch in exactly 12 minutes so he could spend the rest of the period in the library, where at least the books didn't care what he looked like. Mrs. Park, for her part, seemed to have decided he was her charity project. She praised him excessively for ordinary work, her voice taking on that special tone adults use when they want everyone to know how progressive they're being. "See class, Joon-Ayo got a perfect score on his spelling test. Isn't that wonderful?" she would announce, as if his academic success was surprising rather than expected. The praise felt worse than criticism somehow, highlighting his otherness even as it attempted to celebrate him. One spring afternoon in second grade, during a lesson on Korean history, Mrs. Park showed the class pictures of traditional hanbok and asked if anyone had worn one for special occasions. Hands shot up around the room, children eager to share stories of Chuseok and Seoul celebrations. Joon-Ayo kept his hand down even though he had worn hanbok, even though his mother had spent weeks sewing one to fit him perfectly, even though he had dozens of photos of himself in the traditional dress. Joon-Ayo, Mrs. Park called on him anyway, her voice bright with that particular tone that made him want to disappear. Has your family celebrated Korean holidays? Yes, teacher, he said quietly. That's nice that your mother taught you about her culture. The emphasis on her felt deliberate, as if his connection to Korean tradition was borrowed rather than inherent, a loan that could be revoked at any moment. A boy named Taeyoung raised his hand. Teacher, my dad says people who mix races are confused, and their children don't belong anywhere. The classroom went very quiet. Mrs. Park's face flushed, and she cleared her throat. That's not, we should all be respectful of differences. But she didn't say Taeyoung was wrong. She didn't say Joon-Ayo belonged. She just moved quickly to the next part of the lesson, leaving those words hanging in the air like pollution. After class, Joon-Ayo found dirty written on his desk in permanent marker. He spent his recess scrubbing at it with wet paper towels until his hands were red and raw, but the word had seeped into the grain of the wood, permanent as a scar. The janitor found him there, still scrubbing long after the bell had rung. The old man didn't ask questions, just brought industrial cleaner and helped him remove the visible traces of the slur. But both of them knew the word was still there, invisible but not gone, just like all the other invisible wounds Joon-Ayo was learning to carry. That evening, his father found him trying to scrub at his own skin in the bathroom, using his mother's exfoliating soap until his arms were pink and stinging. Joon-Ayo, what are you doing? He looked up, tears streaming down his face, soap suds dripping from his hands. If I scrub hard enough, will I get lighter? His father's face did something complicated, collapsed and hardened at the same time. He gently took the soap from Joon-Ayo's hands, turned off the water, and sat down on the bathroom floor, pulling his son into his lap despite the wet tile and the late hour. Listen to me, he said, his English slipping in the way it did when emotions overwhelmed his Korean. Your skin is beautiful. It is the color of rich earth, of my mother's hands of home. Do you understand? You carry my homeland and your mother's homeland in every cell of your body. That is not something to wash away. That is armor. I don't want armor, Joon-Ayo sobbed. I want to be normal. Normal is a cage, son. Intelligence, that is armor. Kindness is armor. Knowing who you are, that is the strongest armor of all. But 8-year-old Joon-Ayo didn't want to be strong. He wanted to be invisible, or failing that, he wanted to be like everyone else, uniform, unremarkable, safe in the anonymity of belonging. The years accumulated like sediment, each small hurt layering over the last, until Joon-Ayo forgot what it felt like to walk into a room without expecting rejection. Third grade brought Sungmin, who befriended him for 3 whole weeks before his mother found out and forbade the friendship. My mom says your dad might have diseases, Sungmin explained matter-of-factly, as if this was a reasonable concern rather than naked racism. Fourth grade brought a teacher who consistently called him by the wrong name, cycling through Junho and Jaiwoo, and once, memorably, the foreign student, despite repeated corrections. Fifth grade brought the incident with the scissors. He was 11 years old when Yejun cornered him in the bathroom with a pair of craft scissors and 2 friends serving as lookouts. I want to see if your hair is really like wool, Yejun said, reaching for Joon-Ayo's head. Joon-Ayo tried to duck away, but Yejun was bigger, faster, and had backup. He felt the cold metal against his scalp, heard the snip of scissors, and then he was pushing, shoving, fighting with a desperation he'd never accessed before. His fist connected with Yejun's nose, blood bloomed bright red, and suddenly teachers were pulling them apart. Adults were shouting, and Joon-Ayo was being dragged to the principal's office while Yejun wailed about his nose. The principal, Mr. Kim, was a stern man in his 60s who had probably never questioned his place in the world for a single moment. He looked at Joon-Ayo with disappointment that felt somehow worse than anger. "Violence is never the answer," he said, his hands folded on his desk. "I'm calling your parents. This is very serious." "He tried to cut my hair," Joon-Ayo protested, his voice small and thick with unshed tears. "With scissors," he said. "I don't want to hear excuses. You threw the first punch." "Because he was." "Enough, 2 weeks suspension." It was only later, when Joon-Ayo's mother arrived and demanded to know exactly what had happened, that the full story emerged. Even then, Yejun received only 3 days of detention for inappropriate behavior, while Joon-Ayo's suspension stood. The message was clear. Defending yourself was worse than the initial violation, especially when you were already marked as other. During his suspension, Joon-Ayo spent his days at home, watching his mother try to hide her tears and his father grow quieter and quieter. On the 5th day, his father stayed home from work, a luxury they couldn't afford, but that felt necessary somehow. They sat together in the small living room, the television off, the afternoon light slanting through the windows. "Tell me about Nigeria," Joon-Ayo said suddenly. "You're Nigeria before you came here." His father looked surprised. They had always been careful about their dual heritage, trying to balance both cultures without overwhelming the child caught between them. But now, something shifted in his expression. He pulled out his phone and showed Joon-Ayo pictures he'd never seen before, his grandmother's face, round and warm and so similar to his own. His father as a young man, standing in front of a university in a crisp white shirt, pride radiating from every pixel. Lagos streets crowded with life and color and chaos. Family gatherings where everyone looked like Joon-Ayo, where his skin wouldn't have marked him as different, where his hair would have been unremarkable. "This is Yoruba land," his father said softly. "Where your name comes from. Ayo means joy. Your grandmother chose it before you were born. She said you would be a bridge between worlds, and bridges are joyful things because they connect what was separate." "I don't feel like a bridge," Joon-Ayo whispered. "I feel like I'm falling through the gap." His father pulled him close. "Then we will teach you to fly." But learning to fly required wings that Joon-Ayo didn't know how to grow. When he returned to school after his suspension, the whispering had evolved into something more complex. Some students avoided him entirely now, as if violence was contagious. Others looked at him with a new kind of curiosity, not friendly, but less dismissive. He had proven he could fight back, and while that didn't make him popular, it created a tiny buffer of space around him that might have been respect or might have been fear. He couldn't tell which, and he wasn't sure it mattered. Middle school arrived like a storm he'd seen approaching for years but couldn't prepare for. The building was bigger, the students older, and the social hierarchies more rigid and unforgiving. Joon-Ayo had grown taller over the summer, his voice beginning to crack and deepen, his body changing in ways that made him feel like a stranger to himself. He stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror and saw his father's broad nose. His mother's delicate jawline, a combination that was beautiful in theory but felt monstrous in practice. Too African for Korea, too Korean for anywhere else. The questions came differently now, tinged with the particular cruelty of adolescence. "How does it feel to be a mistake?" A girl named Yoonji asked him in English class, her voice carrying across the room during a moment of chaos while the teacher's back was turned. "What?" "Your existence. It's against nature, isn't it? Mixing like that." Joon-Ayo felt the eyes of the classroom on him again, that familiar spotlight of unwanted attention. He wanted to say something cutting, something brilliant that would demolish her argument and make everyone see how ignorant she sounded. Instead, he said nothing. He gathered his books, stood up, and walked out of the classroom, ignoring the teacher's calls to return. He walked through the hallways, out the front doors, and kept walking until he reached the Han River. He sat on the bank for hours, watching the water flow endlessly toward the sea, wondering what it would feel like to be that certain of his direction. His phone buzzed repeatedly. His mother, his father, the school, but he ignored it all. When the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded him of Lagos in his father's photographs, he finally answered his mother's call. "I'm okay," he said before she could speak. I just needed to think. Where are you? The river, near Uedo. Stay there, we're coming. They found him as the last light faded, his parents arriving together, his mother still in her work clothes, his father with grease on his hands from leaving the factory mid-shift. They sat on either side of him, three figures silhouetted against the darkening sky, and for a long moment nobody spoke. Finally, his mother said, "You can't keep running away." "Why not? What's the point of staying?" "Because you belong here," his father said firmly. "You were born here, this is your home." "Then why doesn't it feel like home?" Neither of them had an answer for that. They sat in silence until the security guard came to tell them the park was closing. On the walk back to the subway, Joon-Ayo felt something hardening inside him, a shell forming around the soft parts that kept getting bruised. If he couldn't make people accept him, he could at least make them respect him. He could become so smart, so accomplished, so undeniably excellent that they would have to acknowledge him, even if they never fully welcomed him. That night, he started studying with an intensity that bordered on obsessive. If intelligence was armor, as his father had said, then he would forge the strongest armor anyone had ever seen. He memorized vocabulary until his eyes burned. He practiced math problems until the numbers blurred together. He read history and science and literature, absorbing information like a plant desperate for sunlight. His grades, which had always been good, became exceptional. Teachers started to notice him, for reasons beyond his appearance. But academic success didn't translate to social acceptance. If anything, it created new problems. The other students began to resent his achievements, whispering that he was trying too hard, showing off, compensating for his obvious inadequacies in other areas. When he won the school's speech competition in 8th grade, delivering a flawless presentation on climate change in Korean so perfect it could have come from a textbook, the applause was polite but cold. Afterward, he overheard two teachers talking in the hallway. "His Korean is surprisingly good," one said. "Well, his mother is Korean," the other replied, "though you'd never know it to look at him." Surprisingly good, as if his fluency in his native language was an unexpected bonus rather than a birthright. Joon-Ayo felt something crack inside him, a fault line that had been forming for years finally splitting open. He went to the bathroom and stared at his reflection, really looked at himself for the first time in months. He saw his father's eyes, dark and deep and full of inherited pain. He saw his mother's delicate bone structure, the Korean that lived in the architecture of his face even if others refused to see it. He saw himself, Joon-Ayo, neither fully one thing nor another, but somehow, terrifyingly, wholly himself. That night he cut his hair, not with scissors like Yejun had tried to do, but with clippers he borrowed from his father, buzzing it down to almost nothing. The textured curls that marked him as different fell away in clumps, and he felt lighter, more streamlined, more able to slip through the world unnoticed. When his mother saw him in the morning, she gasped and covered her mouth with her hand. "Why?" was all she could say. "It's easier this way," he replied, and they both knew he wasn't just talking about the hair. His father said nothing, but that evening, Joon-Ayo found a book on his pillow, a collection of essays by mixed-race writers from around the world, people who had grappled with the same questions of identity and belonging. He read it cover to cover that night, and for the first time in his life, he felt seen. These writers understood the unique loneliness of living between categories, the way home could feel like exile and exile could feel like home. They wrote about the pain, yes, but also about the possibility, the chance to build identity from scratch rather than inheriting it wholesale, to choose who to become rather than accepting what others decided you should be. High school arrived with the promise of a fresh start. Joon-Ayo had grown into his height over the summer, his body finally catching up to his elongated limbs. He was handsome now in a way that even he could acknowledge, though he still avoided mirrors when possible. He'd learned to dress carefully, to style his hair in ways that minimized its texture, to present himself as palatable as possible to the people around him. He didn't mention his father unless directly asked. He laughed at jokes about Africa, pretending they didn't land like punches. He made himself small and agreeable and unthreatening, and slowly, painfully, some students began to tolerate him. He even made a friend, A quiet boy named Jihoon who sat next to him in chemistry and didn't seem to care where Joon-Ayo came from. They studied together, ate lunch together, and for a few precious months, Joon-Ayo felt almost normal. Almost. Then Jihoon invited him home for a group study session, and Joon-Ayo met Jihoon's father, a stern businessman who took one look at him and asked, "Where is he from?" "He's Korean," Jihoon said uncertainly. "He's in my class." "I mean originally, his father." The study session happened, but it was the last time Joon-Ayo was invited to Jihoon's house. Their friendship didn't end dramatically. It just faded, the way these things did, Jihoon's texts becoming less frequent until they stopped altogether. Joon-Ayo didn't blame him. He understood that association came with social costs, and he couldn't ask someone else to pay for his existence. Instead, he threw himself deeper into academics. He joined the debate team despite his terror of public speaking, because the debate coach, Mr. Choi, judged arguments on merit rather than messenger. He discovered he was good at it, really good. When he debated, his mixed heritage became irrelevant. All that mattered was the strength of his reasoning, the precision of his language, the power of his argument. On the debate stage, he could be purely intellectual, disembodied, judged solely on the content of his thoughts rather than the container that held them. Mr. Choi noticed his talent and encouraged him to compete at higher levels. "You have a gift," he told Joon-Ayo after a particularly strong performance. "You can make people listen." "They only listen because they have to," Joon-Ayo replied. "It's a competition, they can't walk away." "Maybe at first, but by the end, they're listening because they want to. There's a difference." Joon-Ayo wanted to believe him, but belief required a kind of hope he'd learned to suppress. Still, he continued competing, racking up awards and accolades that his parents displayed with pride. His mother kept a scrapbook of his certificates and medals. His father bragged about him to coworkers who probably didn't care. Their pride was fierce and fragile, a shield against the thousand small cuts their family endured daily. In his junior year, Joon-Ayo's homeroom teacher assigned a personal essay about heritage and identity. Most students wrote bland, surface-level pieces about their family trees and traditional holidays. Joon-Ayo stared at the blank page for a week, the cursor blinking like an accusation, before something inside him broke open and words poured out. He titled it, "Who Decides What a Korean Looks Like?" And he wrote with a rawness he'd never allowed himself before. He wrote about the classroom at 6 years old, about the scissors and the slurs, about scrubbing his skin until it hurt. He wrote about his mother's family, who slowly, painfully, had begun to reconnect after years of silence, but whose acceptance still felt conditional and fragile. He wrote about his father's dreams deferred, the engineering degree that meant nothing in a country that saw him only as foreign labor. He wrote about the loneliness of being perpetually other, the exhaustion of constantly explaining his existence, the rage of being told you don't belong in the only home you've ever known. He wrote about love, too, his parents' stubborn, world-defying love, the way they'd built a family in the face of systematic opposition. He wrote about the small rebellions of mixed children everywhere, the way they carved out space for themselves in societies that had no category for their existence. He wrote about the beauty of being both, the privilege of seeing the world from multiple perspectives, the strength that came from constant negotiation with identity. When he finished, it was 3 a.m. and his hands were shaking. He read it over once, made minor edits, and submitted it before he could second-guess himself. Then he didn't think about it again for 2 weeks. His teacher, Mrs. An, was a younger woman who'd spent several years teaching abroad before returning to Korea. She was different from his previous teachers, more open, more questioning, less bound by traditional hierarchies. When she returned the essays, she asked Joon-Ayo to stay after class. "This essay," she said, holding his paper carefully, as if it might burn her fingers. "This is the most honest, powerful piece of writing I've read in 10 years of teaching." Joon-Ayo didn't know what to say. He'd expected criticism, maybe concern, possibly a referral to the counselor. Not praise. "I want to submit it to the district writing competition," Mrs. An continued. "And I think it should be published in the school literary magazine, with your permission, of course." "People won't like it," Joon-Ayo said quietly. It's going to make people uncomfortable. Good writing should make people uncomfortable. It should challenge them to examine their assumptions. This does that. She paused, studying his face. You have a voice, Joon-Ayo, a powerful one. Don't hide it to make others comfortable. The essay won first place in the district competition. It was published not only in the school magazine, but in a regional education journal. It was posted on the school website, and suddenly, people Joon-Ayo had never met knew his story. The response was overwhelming, some positive, many hostile, all intense. Students who'd never spoken to him approached with variations of, I never thought about it that way, or that must be so hard, or worst of all, you're so brave. Teachers looked at him differently, some with sympathy, others with what might have been guilt. A few parents complained to the administration that the essay was divisive and inappropriate. But the essay also reached people who needed it. Other mixed-race students from different schools who sent messages through the website, thanking him for putting their experience into words. One night, his mother sat him down at the kitchen table with a laptop open in front of her. Your essay has been shared on social media, she said carefully. It's getting a lot of attention. Joon-Ayo felt his stomach drop. Good attention or bad attention? Both, but mostly. Mostly people are moved by it. There's a whole conversation happening about mixed-race identity in Korea because of what you wrote. She showed him the comments, hundreds of them, ranging from supportive to viciously cruel. He read someone calling him a half-breed attention seeker, and someone else saying his essay had made them cry. He saw academic discussions of his words, people analyzing his arguments like he was already a text to be studied rather than a teenager still figuring things out. It was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I can ask them to take it down, his mother said softly, if this is too much. Joon-Ayo thought about all the times he'd been silent, all the moments he'd swallowed his truth to make others comfortable. He thought about the children who would come after him, who would grow up feeling as alone as he had felt. He thought about his grandmother, his father's mother, who he'd never met but who had chosen his name with such hope and intention. Leave it up, he said. Let them talk. The attention from the essay led to an unexpected opportunity. A nonprofit organization dedicated to youth leadership and international exchange reached out to Mrs. An, asking if Joon-Ayo would be interested in participating in a program that brought together young people from different countries to discuss social issues. It was competitive, prestigious, and completely outside anything he'd ever imagined for himself. The application process was grueling, multiple essays, interviews, recommendation letters. Joon-Ayo poured himself into it, seeing the program as a chance to exist in a space where his mixed identity might be an asset rather than a liability. When the acceptance letter arrived 3 months later, he read it 5 times before believing it was real. There was just one complication. The program culminated in a showcase where each participant would represent their home country in a presentation to an international audience. Joon-Ayo would be representing South Korea. The irony wasn't lost on him. The country that had spent his entire life questioning his belonging now wanted him to stand on a global stage as its representative. His first instinct was to refuse, to point out the hypocrisy, to reject them the way they'd rejected him. But his father, who'd been quietly listening to his rant about the absurdity of it all, finally spoke. Do it, he said firmly. Not for them, for you. Show them, show everyone exactly what a Korean looks like. So Joon-Ayo threw himself into preparation. He researched, drafted, revised, and practiced his presentation until he could deliver it in his sleep. He chose to focus on the concept of Han, the Korean notion of collective grief and resilience, and how it manifested in marginalized communities within Korea. It was provocative, challenging, and deeply personal. It was everything he'd been too afraid to say for 18 years, distilled into 15 minutes of carefully crafted argument. The program was held in Geneva, Switzerland. Joon-Ayo's first time leaving Korea, first time on a plane, first time existing in a space where his appearance didn't immediately mark him as an anomaly. The other participants came from dozens of countries, representing every shade of humanity, and for the first time in his life, Joon-Ayo understood what his father had meant about being a bridge. Here, his duality was an asset. The American students saw his Korean perspective. The Korean Americans saw their experience reflected in his story. The African students recognized his father's features in his face and claimed kinship. He was still caught between worlds, but here, between felt less like falling and more like flying. On the day of his presentation, Joon-Ayo stood backstage and felt the familiar weight of his armor, all those years of studying, proving, achieving, building himself into someone undeniable. But underneath the armor, he felt something new. Not quite confidence, but maybe its precursor. Certainty that what he had to say mattered, that his voice deserved space, that his existence was not something to apologize for but something to proclaim. He walked onto the stage in front of an audience of hundreds, dignitaries, educators, students from around the world, and stood behind a podium with a small South Korean flag placed beside his name placard. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. He began speaking in Korean, then switched to English for the benefit of the international audience, his voice steady and clear. "I was 6 years old when I learned that looking different could hurt," he started, and he told them the story. Not all of it. There wasn't time for every wound, every slight, every moment of being made to feel foreign in his own birthplace. But he told them enough. He told them about the violence of exclusion, about the complexity of belonging, about what it meant to be constantly asked to prove your humanity to people who decided in advance that you were less than. But he also told them about resilience, about his parents' love that defied social conventions, about the small rebellions that kept him whole, about the other mixed-race children he'd heard from after his essay, kids who needed to know they weren't alone, about the possibility, the revolutionary possibility, of being exactly who you are without apology. "Korea taught me that I didn't belong," he said, his voice filling the auditorium with quiet power. "So I learned to belong to myself first. I learned that identity isn't something you receive from others. It's something you build with your own hands from whatever materials you're given. My materials were Nigerian and Korean, African and Asian, immigrant dreams and indigenous pride. I built myself from all of it, and I am whole." He paused, letting the words settle. "Today, I stand before you as a representative of South Korea. Some might say I'm not qualified, that my face doesn't match the image this country prefers to project. But I am Korean. I speak the language, I know the history, I carry the culture in my bones alongside my father's culture, my father's language, my father's history. I am both. I am bridge. And that doesn't make me less Korean, it makes me more human." The applause started slowly, then built like a wave. People rose to their feet, not everyone, but enough. Enough that Joon-Ayo felt seen in a way he never had before. He saw tears on some faces, recognition on others. He saw his coordinator nodding with fierce pride. He saw other mixed-race participants giving him thumbs up and knowing smiles. What he couldn't see, because he was in Switzerland and it was the middle of the night in Korea, was the video of his speech being shared on Korean social media. Couldn't see the comments from people who'd never considered what life might be like for mixed-race Koreans. Couldn't see the teachers sharing it in classrooms, the parents confronting their own prejudices, the slow shift in a conversation that had been static for too long. And he couldn't see his grandmother, his Korean grandmother, his mother's mother, who had broken contact when her daughter married a Nigerian man, watching the video on her phone with shaking hands. Couldn't see her crying as she heard her grandson speak with the Seoul accent she'd helped his mother learn as a child. Couldn't see her realization that prejudice had cost her 18 years with this brilliant, brave young man. But Joon-Ayo would learn about all of this later. In the moment, backstage after his presentation, he just felt the armor he'd spent years building start to shift. Not breaking, he would always need protection in a world that wasn't built for people like him. But changing, becoming something less defensive and more expansive. Something that could shield without hiding, protect without denying, defend without diminishing. Mr. Choi had been right. People could listen. And if they listened long enough, sometimes they even heard. The flight back to Seoul felt different than the flight away had felt. Joon-Ayo sat by the window, watching clouds scroll beneath him like an unwritten future, and felt cautiously optimistic for the first time in his life. He'd done it. He'd stood on an international stage and claimed his identity without apology, and the world hadn't ended. If anything, it had expanded. His parents met him at the airport. His mother crying before he'd even cleared customs, his father's eyes bright with pride. They hugged him as if he'd been gone for years instead of 2 weeks, and in the taxi ride home, they told him about the response his speech had generated. "You've started something," his mother said, gripping his hand tightly. "People are talking, really talking." "Some of the talk is very bad," his father warned. "There are people saying terrible things online." "I know," Joon-Ayo said. "There always will be, but there are also people saying good things, people who needed to hear it." His mother's phone rang. She glanced at the screen and her face went white. "What is it?" Joon-Ayo asked. She answered the call, her voice shaking. A pause. "Yes, he's here, he just got back." Another pause, longer this time. Yes, of course, I'll tell him." She hung up and stared at the phone, as if it had transformed into something alien. "Your grandmother wants you to visit," she said quietly. She said she's sorry. She said she wants to know her grandson." The silence in the taxi was profound. Joon-Ayo's father reached across and took his wife's free hand, and the three of them sat connected, processing a moment that had seemed impossible for so long it had stopped feeling like something to hope for. "I don't know if I'm ready," Joon-Ayo finally said. "You don't have to be," his mother replied. "But maybe she's ready now. Maybe your words helped her see what she'd been refusing to look at." They visited the following Sunday. His grandmother's apartment was in an older part of Seoul, filled with traditional furniture and the smell of jeongwa simmering on the stove. She opened the door and Joon-Ayo saw his mother's face in her features, the same delicate bone structure, the same careful eyes. But he also saw fear and regret and tentative hope. "Come in," she said, and her voice cracked on the simple phrase. The visit was awkward at first, conversation stilted and careful. But as the afternoon progressed, as his grandmother served food and asked questions and listened, really listened, to his answers, something began to thaw. She asked about his father, not with hostility but with genuine curiosity, as if finally ready to know the man her daughter loved. She asked about Nigeria, about Joon-Ayo's name, about the parts of him she'd spent years refusing to acknowledge. Before they left, she pulled him aside. "I watched your speech," she said quietly. "I watched it 5 times, and I realized that I threw away 18 years with you because I was afraid of what other people would think. I chose strangers' opinions over my own family." Her eyes filled with tears. "I can't get those years back, but if you'll let me, I'd like to know you now, the real you, all of you." Joon-Ayo felt something release in his chest, a tension he'd carried for so long it had become part of his baseline existence. "I'd like that," he said. It wasn't perfect. Reconciliation never is. There were still awkward moments, still things his grandmother didn't understand, still prejudices she would need to actively unlearn. But it was progress. It was a door opening where before there had only been a wall. In his final semester of high school, Joon-Ayo was offered a scholarship to study at a university that valued diversity and international perspectives. He chose to major in sociology with a focus on mixed-race identity and immigration studies. His personal statement opened with the same line as his essay. "I was 6 years old when I learned that looking different could hurt." But it ended differently. "I am 19 now, and I've learned that looking different can also heal, not just yourself, but others who see their own reflection in your face. I've learned that the spaces between categories are where the most interesting humans live. I've learned that you can't wait for the world to accept you before you accept yourself. You have to go first. You have to be the bridge even when both sides of the river reject you. Especially then." On graduation day, Joon-Ayo stood with his classmates in identical caps and gowns, the uniform clothing making their diversity somehow more visible rather than less. His parents sat in the audience with his grandmother between them, an image that would have been unthinkable 2 years earlier. When his name was called, he walked across the stage to receive his diploma, and the applause was genuine. Not performative, not shocked, not qualified, just applause. After the ceremony, a first-year student approached him nervously. She was clearly mixed race, her features blending Korean and South Asian heritage, her posture defensive in a way Joon-Ayo recognized immediately. "I read your essay," she said quietly. "It helped me, I just wanted you to know." Joon-Ayo felt his eyes sting with unexpected tears. "It gets easier," he told her, and he believed it. "Not because the world changes overnight, but because you get stronger. You learn to carry it." Did you ever stop wishing you were different? He thought about the question seriously. "Sometimes I still do," he admitted. "But mostly now I'm glad I'm exactly who I am. The hard parts made me pay attention. They made me think about identity and belonging and humanity in ways I might never have otherwise. They made me fight for every inch of space I occupy in the world, which means I never take that space for granted." He paused. "You're going to be okay. Better than okay." She nodded, blinking back tears, and walked away looking slightly less burdened than when she'd approached. That night, Joon-Ayo's family had a celebration dinner at his father's request. They went to a Nigerian restaurant that had recently opened in Itaewon, one of the few places where Joon-Ayo's father could find food that tasted like home. The owner recognized his father, greeted him in Yoruba, and then turned to Joon-Ayo with a wide smile. "Omo Yoruba," he exclaimed. "You look just like your father. What's your name?" "Joon-Ayo," he replied. "Ah, good name. Joy. That's what we need more of in this world." He clapped Joon-Ayo on the shoulder. "Your father tells everyone about you. The smart son who speaks Korean like a Seoul native and stands up for what's right. He's very proud." Joon-Ayo looked at his father, who was suddenly very interested in the menu. His mother smiled, and his grandmother, who had never been to a Nigerian restaurant before and looked slightly overwhelmed but determined, reached across the table and squeezed Joon-Ayo's hand. "We're all proud," she said. Over jollof rice and plantains and pepper soup that made his grandmother's eyes water, they talked about the future. Joon-Ayo's plans for university, his father's hope to finally visit Lagos with his family, his mother's dreams of opening a small business. His grandmother talked about reconnecting with the rest of the family, about helping them understand what she'd learned, that love was bigger than prejudice, that family was more important than social convention. "I wasted so much time," she said sadly, "being afraid." "You're here now," Joon-Ayo's mother said gently. "That's what matters." As they ate and talked and laughed, Joon-Ayo felt something he'd been searching for his entire life without knowing the shape of it. He felt like he belonged. Not because everyone accepted him, many people still didn't, and probably never would, but because he'd finally accepted himself. He'd stopped waiting for permission to exist fully, stopped apologizing for the space he occupied, stopped trying to make himself palatable to people who decided in advance they wouldn't swallow. He thought about the 6-year-old boy who'd stood at the front of a classroom and learned that looking different could hurt. That boy was still part of him, would always be part of him. But that boy had grown into someone who knew that looking different could also be powerful, could open doors and start conversations and change minds. That difference wasn't deficit. That bridge building, while exhausting, was also necessary and worthwhile. Later that night, back in his room surrounded by boxes half-packed for the move to university, Joon-Ayo opened his laptop and began to write. Not an essay this time, but a letter to his future self, to the Joon-Ayo who would face new challenges in new spaces, who would continue navigating the complicated terrain of mixed identity in a world obsessed with categories and borders. "Remember," he wrote, "that you didn't get here by making yourself smaller. You got here by insisting on taking up space, by refusing to apologize, by building yourself from every material you were given. Remember that your existence challenges people, and that's okay. That's even necessary. Remember that being a bridge means you'll sometimes feel the weight of both sides, but you'll also see views that people stuck on one shore never will. Remember that your parents loved each other enough to face down a world that told them not to, and you are the living proof that love wins. Remember that your grandmother came back, which means change is always possible. Remember that there are kids coming up behind you who need to see that someone like them can not just survive but thrive. Remember that you belong to yourself first, and everything else follows from that. Remember that you are enough. Remember that you are whole. Remember that you are bridge, and bridges are joyful things because they connect what was separate." He saved the document, closed the laptop, and looked out his window at Seoul stretched out below him in a galaxy of lights. This city that had rejected him and claimed him in equal measure. This home that never felt entirely like home, but was home nonetheless. This complicated, frustrating, beautiful place that had shaped him into who he was. Somewhere out there, another mixed-race child was probably crying themselves to sleep, feeling impossibly alone, wondering if it would ever get better. Joon-Ayo couldn't reach them all, couldn't shield them from the pain he'd experienced. But he could keep speaking, keep writing, keep existing loudly and unapologetically as proof that survival was possible. That not just survival, flourishing was possible. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He knew that. University would bring new challenges, new spaces to navigate, new assumptions to combat. There would be people who questioned his Koreanness, people who couldn't see past his appearance, people who made him explain himself over and over again. But he also knew he was ready. He'd spent his entire life building armor, and now he understood that the strongest armor was simply being completely, authentically himself. His phone buzzed with a message from the first-year student he'd met after graduation. "Thank you for today," it read. "I'm going to try to be brave like you." Joon-Ayo smiled and typed back, "You already are." Before going to sleep, he stood in front of the mirror, something he'd avoided for so many years. He looked at his reflection without flinching, without wishing it was different. He saw his father's strength and his mother's determination. He saw Lagos and Seoul, Africa and Asia, past and future. He saw Joon-Ayo, bridge builder, truth teller, the child Korea tried to reject who had grown into someone undeniable. Not Korean enough, people had said his whole life, as if Koreanness was a finite resource that could be measured and depleted. But standing there, whole and complex and completely himself, Joon-Ayo knew the truth. He wasn't less Korean because of his father. He was more human because of both his parents. He was exactly Korean enough because he said so, because he lived it, breathed it, embodied it in every word he spoke and every action he took. Because identity wasn't something you received from others, it was something you claimed for yourself. The child Korea tried to reject had rejected rejection itself, and in doing so, had become exactly who he was meant to be. If you found Joon-Ayo's story moving and powerful, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss stories that challenge, inspire, and change perspectives. Drop a comment below sharing your own experiences with identity and belonging. Your stories matter, and this community is built on shared voices and mutual understanding. And if you believe this story needs to be heard by others, smash that like button and share it with someone who needs to know they're not alone in their journey. Together, we're building bridges and rewriting the narrative about what belonging really means. Thank you for being part of this conversation.